Hey everyone, and welcome back to my favorite format, Timeless. Lately, a lot of people have been asking me for my thoughts on the current meta, and have also been asking me, hey, I'm new to Timeless, I'm new to Best of 3, what deck should I be picking up? What deck should I be trying to beat? Hopefully this video will give good answers to all of those questions. I'm going to go over the entire format, every deck in the format, from the POV of a top-ranked player who's been grinding this format every single day. I'm going to give each deck a minute or two of thoughts, explaining its current place in the metagame, what it's good against, what it's not good against, and how you should, in general, be building the deck and building sideboards for it. We're going to be putting things into a tier list, and I will disclaim before I start that this is mostly my opinion. I am one guy who's been playing this format all day, so there are going to be biases in what I say. You might disagree with me, and also the format is going to change a lot. Timeless is what I consider an unsolved format because it has a pretty low player count. So these ratings definitely can and will change. I'm thinking of maybe doing a video like this once per set release. Now that Modern Horizons has been out for about a month, I think now is a good time to assess where the meta currently sits after Modern Horizons. I'm going to talk about decks one at a time, but I'm going to place all of my tier 1 decks up on the board at once just so I can cross-reference them with each other, because it is really important to understand these decks in the context of each other. Show and Tell is the premier combo deck of the format and has been ever since the card was printed into the format. It is a deck that threatens to win on turn 3, sometimes early as turn 2 in some builds of the deck, and it is a simple and straightforward A plus B combo that can very easily go through their deck and tutor a win condition out of their sideboard to win on the spot. It is pretty resilient to hate because they can play cards like Force of Vigor and a bunch of 0-mana answers to any sort of sideboard cards you might throw at them. Of course, it is something that you can hate with sideboard cards, but always know that Show and Tell can be a step ahead of you. Show and Tell also brings some crazy tech like Born Upon a Wind, where they can blow up your sideboard card in your upkeep and then win on your upkeep. The deck is very strong. It is quite literally meta-defining. If you look at the rest of these decks that we have up here in Tier 1, they all have new Modern Horizons cards or the new pitch elementals from special guests. So in the past, Show and Tell might have even been closer to Tier 0.5. However, the deck is now much closer to being kept in check by the other decks of the format. However, it is still very strong. It is still the deck to beat. It is the reason that you're going to put Vexing Bauble, Deafening Silence, and Surgical Extraction type effects in your sideboard. Surgical is not necessarily best against them. Try Thoughtseize first, but if you are playing against the graveyard version of it, which we'll cover later, definitely pack those Surgicals. The other tier 1 deck that we need to mention is Energy. Now, Energy is incredibly strong. I love the deck personally. It's what I've been playing on this channel the most. It's the deck I got top ranked with last season. Last season I finished number 9 on ladder playing Energy variants. I love the deck to death. It's incredibly strong. It has crazy fast goldfishing hands where you can pretty easily and consistently win the game on turn 4 just by turning your creature sideways or flipping into Johnny to a Goblin Bombardment, pumping the board with a Guide of Souls, going crazy with Ocelot Pride. This deck is nuts. It plays some hyper efficient threats such as Amped Raptor and a Johnny, which are always 2-for-1s. It plays Guide of Souls and Ocelot Pride and Ragavan, all of the messed up 1-drops. It is the best removal in the format in Galvanic Discharge, Static Prison, and Swords to the Plowshares. Like, the deck truly has it all. One thing that is worth mentioning are the variants of this deck. I am classifying them all as one deck because I think they are quite close to each other. In my opinion, the best version of the deck right now, give my best of 3 player here, my biases, is the Mardu version that I've been playing a lot that has Lurrus, Chthonian Nightmare. I think that is the best. It is a little bit better than the Flage Gigantha Blood Moon version, and that version is just straight Boros. And then I think for best of 3, the straight Boros and Lurrus version is a little bit worse. There's also a Legends version of that deck. I think that is a bit worse. For best of 1, it's a bit more passable. At least in my opinion, if you want to pick up this deck today, definitely look at my Mardu version of the deck. Just find a recent video of it from the channel, or you can go for the Blood Moon version if you are a Blood Moon lover like me. Up next, we have the other 2 Tier 1 decks, the Tier 1.5 decks. First, let's talk about Dimir Tempo. This deck is really sweet, and I'm so happy that we have a true Tempo deck as a Tier 1 deck in Timeless right now. This deck has the advantage of having an absolutely fantastic Show and Tell matchup because it can put on the pressure quickly with cards like Nethergoyf, Psychic Frog, threatening to do crazy things like flipping a Tamiyo super early, and it can also just back them up with every spell, Pierce, Mana Drain, and good counterspell in the format. They can control the board while putting on pressure, which makes it a really, really tough matchup for show and tell and any sort of unfair decks. So if you're looking to rip those decks to shreds, absolutely give Dimir Tempo a try. However, it does suffer from bad matchups. An energy deck is just going to be able to slam a bunch of creatures on the board and slam them on the board so fast that Dimir Tempo can't do anything about it, especially if the energy deck is on the play. The matchup does become rather abysmal for the Tempo deck, but the Tempo deck is still very strong. It can win games against energy. It has done it, and it has very, very strong matchups against all of the combo decks in the format, so it is definitely a tier 1 deck. Not quite as meta defining as show and tell and energy, which is why it is one slot lower on the tier list than them, but I still think it's a fantastic deck to pick up if you like that style of gameplay. Last in tier 1 is going to be Beans. Again, I don't think this is truly meta defining like show and tell and energy, but this is the best scam build that I've seen so far. Scam meaning those pitch elementals that came with the bonus sheet from Modern Horizons 2. This version of the deck uses the card Up the Beanstalk to draw a card every single time you cast something like a Fury and a Solitude for free. These decks also usually play Omnath. They can sometimes play Yorion. They are the classic money pile, value pile. The downside of these decks is that they are very expensive to craft, and they can be very, very clunky sometimes. Beans doesn't run discard, so it can have a really tough time against combo decks, but it can absolutely outvalue any sort of creature deck to ever touch it. Like, it does have a lot of strengths like that, but when you're building Beans, keep in mind you are the slow and dirtily deck. There are some times where the other deck is just going to go fast and it's going to be like 2 ships passing in the night and you're going to lose on your own turn 3 and you're going to wonder where it all went wrong. And Beans, of course, is very, very, very weak to Blood Moon and any sort of land destruction effects. Not too common in the format right now, but if those things do start to come into the format more and more, Beans is really going to struggle. But otherwise, like, it is the best value deck that you could possibly play, and you are going to outvalue and outcard quality your opponents every single time. Next, we're going to move on to Tier 2, and the first deck I want to talk about in Tier 2 is Jeskai Control. It's awesome. We have a control deck right up to follow the rest of these decks. I think that the control mages have figured out the best build of control, and this build is currently getting carried by the card Flage. Flage is crazy strong. It's the escape elemental brother to Uro and Kroxa, and in my opinion, Flage is perhaps even stronger than Uro, especially in a control deck. It is a card that can control the board, gain you some life, buy you some time. It is a game-ending threat. It is your win condition all in one. It also pitches to your good pitch elementals, which are Solitude and Fury in this deck. This deck also runs Mana Drain, so you can Mana Drain out a One Ring or just Mana Drain out a Fury or even a Big Teferi early. This deck is very strong. It's very well positioned, and the reason I like it so much is because it's still getting figured out. Control decks are the hardest to build, and the control mages have been hard at work, and they've gotten through like a lot of different iterations of the deck, and we're seeing some really good ones come out. Another card that it runs that is very well positioned in the meta right now is Wrath of the Skies. Wrath of the Skies is the best board wipe in the format right now. It's the energy board wipe that says pay X energy, destroy every artifact, creature, and enchantment with mana value X or less. That is really strong against the Boros and Mardu energy decks because it blows up their cards like Unstable Amulet, Chthonian Nightmare, Blood Moon, Static Prison, all those little enchantments that they stick in play and they rely on for card advantage or removal. You can just blow those up and you can laugh in their face. It's amazing. Up next in Tier 2, we have Shift and Tell. I didn't separate out the energy variants, but I am going to split the two Show and Tell variants. Shift and Tell is a graveyard-based Show and Tell variant, where it is based around the card Shifting Woodland, and using that to copy an Omniscience. Shift and Tell also runs the actual card Show and Tell as well, so they can just do the combo from hand. And the idea is that you're trading off like some of the speed and being built purely around your combo for the resilience of being able to also combo from your graveyard, which is really interesting and really strong. I've seen several different builds of Shift and Tell at this point, and the reason I'm putting it as its separate tech is because I think it is evolving in a different direction. I've seen multiple different players on ladder pick this deck up now. I've seen people take it in multiple different directions, so I really do think it is a deck of its own. It also has different strengths and weaknesses. Like, this is a deck that is more resilient to discard, because if you just discard the Omniscience, they're just going to copy it, right? You need graveyard hate, you need like a Pithing Needle to hit the woodland, or you need a Surgical Extraction to extract their Omniscience from the graveyard. This deck is very, very weak to Surgical, by the way. It really just falls apart when your opponent plays Surgical. but it is a tough deck to sideboard against if you can't Surgical the Omniscience, because they can either just win from hand or just win from the battlefield. And most sideboard cards really only cover one of those cases. Up next in tier more 2.5 is going to be Goblin Charbelcher, which in my opinion is the best non-omniscience, non-show and tell combo deck in the format. Goblin Charbelcher is a deck that can win on turn 2 pretty often. I had a video playing it recently where I won with turn 2 on it. You can even have a turn 1 nut win if you have Double Dark Ritual. I think you need Double Dark Ritual, Beseech the Mirror, a Charbelcher in your hand, and like another 0 mana or 1 mana little artifact to sacrifice to Beseech, and then you just win on turn 1. It is a very fast, it is a bit glass cannon-y as a deck, because, you know, it can die to a Pithing Needle, but of course, since you're a Beseech the Mirror deck, at least my build is a Beseech the Mirror deck, you can Beseech the Mirror for your sideboard piece, blow up the Pithing Needle, and then win the next turn. It is a bit more fragile than Show and Tell, because I know Show and Tell also can just die to a counter spell, but this deck does not have blue to fight back at all against control mages, and it can really struggle when its pieces get discarded. It doesn't have as many ways to dig through the deck for the combo pieces like the Show and Tell deck. It plays Dig Through Time and Assemble the Team. The Belcher deck, it does play some of those. I think my version just had the Assembles, but it is not quite as good as Show and Tell. It's a little more fragile. It is technically a 1-card combo, but you do need to produce 7 mana somehow in order to get that card into play. So you're always going to be gate kept on speed, and you also need like that cluster of cards that can make you 7 mana. So as much as it is a 1-card combo deck, you need several cards to set up your 1-card combo. So it's very good, don't get me wrong, especially in best of 1. I think this is a great way to win games, and even in best of 3, you do get to access to some pretty decent sideboard cards in green and black to defend yourself. So I think this is a solid choice for if you're a combo mage and you don't like Show and Tell, go ahead and play some Belcher. Also has a very, very good energy matchup. All these unfair decks are how you dunk on energy. You want to dunk on energy, play the unfair decks. All right, up next in tier 2 is a deck I don't see as much, but I think this is the best scam build that is not beans, and this is Esper Scam. Esper Scam, how I've seen it built, also plays Psychic Frog, which is why I called it Frog Animator. So you could Psychic Frog to discard your elementals and then use the card Reanimate on them, or you could even play Atraxa in the deck. Psychic Frog discards Atraxa, Reanimate it. That's some sweet stuff. I think that this is probably the best non-bead build of Scam Elementals. We've seen other scam builds. I'm going to rate them like traditional Rakdos scam from Modern really falls short and timeless, but this deck has very high quality. It has ways to get the card advantage back in the form of Atraxa and Satoru, giving you advantage for casting things for free. It plays a bunch of other really decent cards to back up its elementals like Orcish Bowmasters, and just being a Solitude plus Grief deck does cover all of your bases pretty well. Grief covers your bases against the unfair decks. Solitude keeps the fair decks at bay. I think this deck is a good all-rounder, and having access to blue and access to counter magic is always a good thing. So this deck can sideboard really well and really adjust its game plan depending on what it's playing against. And I hope more people pick this deck up and more people get working on this deck, because I really think there is something there. All right, after tier 1 and tier 2, I'm going to go through the decks in a somewhat random order. They're mostly in alphabetical order, so we're going to populate the bottom tiers of the tier list somewhat at random. Keep in mind, these decks aren't terrible. Tier 3 decks are still decent, and you can still absolutely get Mythic with Tier 3, even Tier 4 decks. And a lot of these are better in Best of 1s. My evaluations are mostly for Best of 3. So we're going to start off with a deck that is a lot better in Best of 1, and that is 8 Flare. So there's a really cool self-mill deck. Sometimes it plays like Glimpse to self-mill itself. Sometimes it just plays Citrus Supplier and has that mill happen incidentally. But it's the idea that you're running a bunch of cool recursive graveyard threats like Prized Amalgam and Bloodghast, and using cards like Citrus Supplier to fill your graveyard to get those things back. And then on top of that, you are playing the good Flare cards from Modern Horizons 3, which are Flare of Malice and Flare of Denial. Flare of Denial is straight up counterspell. Flare of Malice is a very strong removal spell in the format currently. And I like this deck a lot. I think the fact that it can play those 8 free spells really gives it a leg up. So the thing that's keeping it at fringe tier right now is the fact that it just dies to graveyard hate. So in Best of 1, it's pretty good. In Best of 3, it might even be tier 5. I do have a lot of hope for this deck with the new set Bloom Burrow. Bloom Burrow is a really low power level set, not bringing much to the format, but one card I'm interested in for this deck is Huskburster Swarm. It's a way for this deck to win through graveyard hate. So if you self-mill and then your opponent slams a Rest in Peace, you'll at least have a Huskburster Swarm as an alternate win condition. It's definitely something to think about. Up next, we have Amalia combo, which I really like because this is a combo deck that is also just a Lurrus deck. So you can build this as like a fair, grindy, mid-ranging Lurrus deck, and then it just has the combo backdoor built in. Unfortunately, there are much better combos to be playing in Timeless, and there are also a lot better Lurrus decks to be building. However, since this deck has a lot of versatility and it does both, I do like it. I think there's room for innovation. Maybe somebody could figure out a really good Amalia build and it can move up to tier 3, maybe even slightly higher. But I think this is a weak tier 3.5 deck right now. I do love that it's a Lurrus deck. I do love that the deck is really strong, even excluding the Amalia combo, and I love how you could just like Court of Calling for a win. But there are objectively more powerful things to do in Timeless than Amalia. And right next to Amalia, I'm going to go ahead and grab Sam because I view these decks as really similar to each other. Me personally, I think Amalia is just a little better as a deck if you are split between which of those that you want to build, but Sam combo is also pretty sweet. Same thing, you could build a Lurrus deck. Sam is actually like a fine mid-range piece, as is Amalia. Like I'm been pleasantly surprised when I was trying to play Amalia of like how good Amalia was just as a mid-range piece that, you know, occasionally gain life off of a Guide to Souls and it'll draw you a bunch of cards and grow bigger. That's really sweet. So the fact that these Lurrus decks have strong mid-range pieces and have access to a combo is nice. However, the combo is way too slow and not high power level enough for Timeless, but the versatility of being the good Lurrus deck and the combo deck is going to keep these decks relevant, in my opinion. Somebody might figure out a build that takes either of these combo decks even higher in the tiers, but right now they're just low tier 3. Up next, we are going to be rating Black Devotion. I think Black Devotion is a tier 3 deck right now, and I'm going to find my other mono black midrange deck, and we're going to put it in tier 3.5. So mono black midrange with like Shieldred and the One Ring, Dark Ritual was my favorite deck to play before Modern Horizons 3 came out. And I really think like this, it was a good deck. It was at least tier 2. It was my main deck that I was playing all the time, so I'm a little bit biased. But unfortunately, it's really fallen off with Modern Horizons 3, and one of the main things that made it fall off is the fact that we actually have good aggro decks in the format right now, and we have other really good value generators that are degenerately fast. So if you look at the tier 1 decks right now, all of these except Show and Tell did not exist before Modern Horizons 3. None of the energy cards were on the format, none of the elementals were on the format, and then we didn't have the really good cards like Psychic Frog and Tameo that were the glue that holds this deck together. So really, all that you were doing is fighting against Show and Tell, just discarding them so they couldn't do their thing, and then being degenerate fast to get under the good control decks that were in the format. That's what Black Midrange is really good at. You could have a degenerate turn 1 Reanimate hand, you can have a degenerate like One Ring on turn 2 with Dark Ritual, and that was often good enough. Often going Thoughtseize turn 1 and then turn 2 land, Dark Ritual, One Ring was enough that you could just keep Show and Tell at bay and keep them off of comboing forever. However, there's matchups like Energy, where they don't care how many times you Thoughtseize them, and they don't care how many times you wipe their board. They're just going to keep playing more threats. So the Black midrange deck, unfortunately, cannot keep up with matches like that. Also, now that there's pitch elementals in the format, just going like Dark Ritual Shieldred or doing Troll Cycle and Reanimate the Troll is not the only degenerate fast thing you could do. You could play the pitch elementals, which are super, super strong, and they're in all the colors of the rainbow, not just black. So I think mono black midrange built around Shieldred and the Ring has fallen off a bit. And it's one of my favorite decks, right? So I spent a lot of time trying to figure it out, and unfortunately, like I couldn't figure out a build. I'm curious if anybody else has any ideas for this deck, but I think it's a really weak tier 3 deck. It might even move down to tier 4 as the format evolves. However, I do have one idea for maybe saving mono black, and that's playing the Devotion version. Made a few videos with this recently. I think the Devotion build of black might be back in style because it solves the energy problem by just trying to like win on turn 3 or 4 and also by gaining a shit ton of life. The idea here is instead of building around Shieldred and the One Ring, you build around Necropotence, you play a bunch of random Devotion cards, you draw a shit ton of cards, and then you slam a Gary, and then you win with that card. It's performing better for me. I still think it's just tier 3. It's not great, but it's definitely like a fine deck to climb with if you think it's fun. And, you know, people can work on it. Like I said, this tier list is work in progress, and this format is not solved. There's only so many people playing this. So if you love this deck and you want to work on it and try to make it better, I totally believe it can go up in the tiers. All right, up next is Jeskai Breach, which is going to go in Fringe. This is a really interesting deck that has seen play in Timeless in the past, and I think it's still an okay idea. The idea of Jeskai Breach is usually it's a Fair Lurrus deck that's just a Dragon's Rage Channeler Ragavan deck. But in your Dragon Rage Channeler deck, you also have Underworld Breach and Mox Amber. So what you can do is if you have multiple DRCs in play, you play a Mox Amber from your graveyard with Breach out, you mill a couple of cards off of the Surveil with the DRC, play another Mox Amber, Legend Rule the original one, mill more cards, and then you keep looping that, and then it's infinite mana. As long as you can mill 3 cards per cast, you can go through your whole deck and find a Thassa's Oracle. It's the idea, at least. It's been good at points in the past. I think it's still like an okay idea to try to build. I like that it is a Lurrus deck. As I've said before, I've said this so many times, but I think that if you put a combo into a Lurrus deck, that is pretty sweet. And it's also a blue deck, generally, how it's built. It's usually built in Jeskai so that you get access to Mana Drain and other counter spells to protect your combo. I've also seen people build it with Teferi Time Raveler plus the cat, Displacer Kitten. That's another way to do a combo with Mox Amber to infinitely draw your library. So you could do that as well. I would consider those, pretty similar decks. I would just call it like Jeskai Kitten combo. It would also be tier 4. It is definitely an idea. But it's not particularly strong right now. However, maybe work on it. Displacer Kitten at 4 mana might be a little bit much, but maybe there is a Dragon's Rage Channeler shell that you can build that acts as a tempo deck that just has a backdoor win condition with Underworld Breach. I'd be happy to see somebody try to build that. Up next is Boros Scam Blood Moon. I've played this a lot on the channel, so I think people are going to be familiar with it. If not, just go look up one of my videos. I think this is really sweet, and I think this is probably the next best scam build after the Esper one. This one really, really preys on fair decks. So if you're queuing ladder a lot and you just keep getting energy, play this. Play Fury, Ephemerate it, get him out. It's just so strong against fair decks. Unfortunately, it's weak to show and tell in the same that Boros energy is, because you're more or less get access to the same sideboard cards plus Blood Moon. So you need to just jam a Blood Moon, jam a Deafening Silence, and hope that you don't get hit by a Force of Vigor. So it's a bit polarizing in the matchups, but if you love Blood Moon and you really want to dunk on the fair decks, absolutely consider playing this. Up next, we have the classic Dimir control, and this is like the Mistman style Dimir control deck where the only creatures it plays is Lurrus Companion, 4 Orcish Bowmasters. It is a heinously slow deck, and it was very, very good back before Modern Horizons 3 when Show and Tell was the only tier 1 deck, and it was the deck to beat. And it was a fantastic deck, especially when a really good control pilot would play it, just because it can control the board, and there was no deck that went too fast. But unfortunately, 2 things completely killed this deck. The first is the idea of Scam Element. In the past, there were really no 0 mana plays in Timeless, so this deck could hold up Mana Drain and just counter everything that was important, and that was plenty good enough for this deck in order to be able to thrive. But now what happens is that somebody evokes a Grief, turn 0, before you can even answer. They look at your hand, they take your Mana Drain, they play a Swamp, they reanimate it, they take your other answer. That gets under this deck, and the other problem is Energy, which is a deck that can flood the board and doesn't respond well to 1-for-1 answers. You can't 1-for-1 answer all of their cards except on the stack, but you can't counter multiple things a turn usually. So unfortunately, this style of control is pretty dead in Timeless. This was literally tier 1. Now tier 5. Crazy. Maybe someone like Mistman who's really cracked at control could make this work again. But I think that this deck is now completely outdated in favor of these new Dimir tempo decks. All right, up next are the Birthing Ritual decks that I've been playing a lot on the channel. I'm going to put them at tier 3, even if, to be honest, it might be closer to tier 3.5, just because I think there's a lot of room for innovation within the shell. And I think somebody can figure out a really good anti-meta version of it, or they can really refine the shell and make it a bit more powerful. Maybe realistically it could be down here at 3.5, but I'm really high on Birthing Ritual. I've had a lot of success just chaining Birthing Ritual into Renegade Rallier. I've had a lot of success digging for sideboard cards off of a Birthing Ritual. I think these decks have legs. We just need the hundreds of man hours from good players who try and figure out the best build that really pops off in the current Timeless meta. Up next is Grixis aggro, which is your Death Shadow style Suicide Zoo deck, as you would want to call it. Unfortunately, this is another one that has fallen by the wayside after Modern Horizons 3. The current Dimir Tempo deck does exist as a much better version of it. I haven't really seen anybody have success with Death Shadow. I've had some people just try to shoehorn Death Shadow into the Dimir Tempo list, and that's totally fine, but I think like the classic style of Grixis aggro, where you're just playing a couple of cheap threats like Death Shadow, Scourge of the Skyclaves, you're trying to team or battle rage them. I think that one is also unfortunately dead due to the rise of these guys again. Why is it when a deck dies, it's always energy and scam elementals being able to answer them? Well, sometimes you win and sometimes your Death Shadow gets hit by a Solitude and you cry. Looks like all the tier 5s are coming through at once in the alphabet, but unfortunately, another deck that used to be really freaking good and timeless that now just fell off is Jund. And I don't want to blame energy again, but man, Jund can't keep up with that deck. So Jund is not a Lurrus deck, like you would think, but it is a deck that plays Jarsel and Minskin and a bunch of really busted 3 and 4 drops. They have like the nastiest curve outs in the game because they also play all the good 1s and 2s in their color, of course. So it's going to go Thought Season to Tarmogoyf into Jarsel, flashback the Thought Season to Minskin, and then Jarsel can flashback the Tarmogoyf that you killed. So it's a crazy deck with crazy curves out. It kills really fast. Minskin Boo is the kind of card that's used to kill fast in Legacy. That's how good it is. But unfortunately, not good enough when a tier 1 deck is an aggro deck that can go wider. Unfortunately, it's fallen off. I could maybe believe that a Lurrus version of Jund could be good in the current meta, but I would consider that a different deck from the Minskin Boo Jarsel build of Jund. Up next is Mono Green Flare of Cultivation Ramp, and this is different from Primeval Titan decks. I've seen some people play this. It's an interesting fringe strategy where you're just ramp, 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 and your payoffs are Karn with a Wishboard, the One Ring, just buy you some time, and occasionally they have Eldrazi in the main deck, and it's interesting. I don't think it's good right now, but maybe there's something there that could be refined and worked on, which is why it's going to make the list and it's going to be infringed here. Maybe there's something there, maybe there's not. Up next is Nadu. Ah, the Scourge of Modern. Just kidding. I haven't seen a good Nadu build in Timeless yet. Tier 5 is generally like reserved on this tier list for decks that were good recently that fell off. Nadu is the one deck that I'm going to put there that never was good just because of how infamously good it is in other formats, how much people try to insist that you can build the Nadu deck in Timeless, and how few times I've seen people succeed. Now, in my opinion, Nadu is the most likely deck to come out of tier 5 and make its way up the tier list if somebody figures it out. But right now, like I've seen so many people try to build it, and I've yet to actually seen like proof, like an untapped.gg profile of somebody who played 100 games with it, got mythic, and had over a 60 win rate. And that's the bar for being good in this format. And I haven't seen it yet. Like no one's actually putting up the good results here. There aren't too many timeless tournaments, so that's mostly what we go off of. Like I know I sound like I set a high bar with a 60 win rate over 100 games, but like look at my profile. I have a 75 win rate with energy, well over 100 games. Honestly, I think I have 100 games with multiple variants of energy at this point, 100 games each. That is the standard for being a tier 1 deck in this format if a good player is playing it. So the fact that like I haven't seen anybody have a significant amount of success with Nanu makes me think that there's just not a good build out there. I've seen builds and they all kind of just dirtle, too slow. There's no way to win on the spot with it. If you're building Nadu in this format, you're generally building the value version because there's no 0 mana targets except for Inventor's Axe. But then you need to be generating 2 energy per target, which is also difficult to do. It theoretically could be done with enough Guide of Souls, but why not just play a normal person energy deck at that point? I'm curious if someone could break Nadu though. Somebody please like make me eat my words and prove me wrong and get top 10 with this deck, please. I would love it. All right, up next is Necrostorm, which is a really interesting deck that I think is really good, but I think only one person on ladder knows how to play this. I've only ever seen one guy play this. It's pretty strong. The idea is that like you necropotence, you go as low on life total as you possibly can, and then you get a hand that has a bunch of fast mana, and then Weather the Storm or Tendrils of Agony to either gain a bunch of life so you can necro again, or you just kill with the Tendrils of Agony. It's really interesting, and I think the deck is pretty good. Maybe it goes to 3.5. I'm thinking about it a little more. I haven't seen it too much lately. I think it's definitely something that you could try to pick up. I want to see the community pick it up because like nobody is working on it right now. Small community in Timeless, and I haven't seen anybody try to push the Necrostorm deck forward. So I'm going to put it there in tier 3.5 because it's a deck that I want to see people pick up and I want to see people like try to work on and make better because I think there's something there. It didn't get new cards in Modern Horizons 3, but before Modern Horizons 3, it was like very, very good. And it still has to be at least decent. All right, up next is Buried Alive Phoenix, which is actually a tier 3 deck. Maybe not the best tier 3 deck, so we're going to put it in tier 3.5, but it's put up some decent results. In best of one, it's probably a lot higher. It might even be tier 2 in best of one. It's a very good BO1 deck. Unfortunately, it does die to Graveyard Hate really easily. It does die to Surgical Extraction, but I have seen people have a lot of success with the Phoenix. It's very easy to do if you have Dark Ritual and Buried Alive and a Ham Sandwich in your hand. You get a bunch of Hasty Birds back. I've also seen some people like try to hybridize the deck with Scam or hybridize the deck with Sorin, and it's interesting. Those builds are probably better for best of 3. So I'm putting this in tier 3.5. It's not a great deck, but it's a deck I want to see people work on. See if you can maybe hybridize it like those other decks, like I said. See if you can make it a bit better for best of 3. Up next is Primeval Titan combo, which used to be a scourge of the format, but is unfortunately just unplayable nowadays. This is a format where Mana Drain is a very common and abundant card, and you simply cannot cast the card Natural Order in a format where Mana Drain is that good and abundant. Also, Primeval Titan, at the end of the day, even though it's a degenerate combo deck, actually does have to attack and win through creature combat in this format. There's no Valakut in the format. It just not win on the spot. There's no Amulet of Vigor, so it can't be that explosive. This is just a deck that turbos out of prime time and hope it's enough. And unfortunately, it really doesn't seem like it's enough after Modern Horizons 3, compared to the speed at which Boros can impact the board without having to rely on cheating and relying on their main card not getting counterspelled. Prime time really doesn't have it anymore, unfortunately. Up next is Rakdos Burn, which I think is a really solid tier 3 deck. This is the deck I recommend for new players. I have a video on it if you want to watch it. I think Burn is always going to perennially be a tier 3 because it can always feast on the greedy mana bases of some decks. It can always kill some decks before they can go do their thing. Unfortunately, Guide of Souls being the flagship card in the tier 1 deck is holding it back a little bit. Burn would be a little bit better if Guide of Souls didn't exist. But I do think Burn is a great pickup. It's also just like a fantastic budget deck. It's straightforward to pilot. So if you're brand new to Timeless or brand new to Best of 3, pick up this deck. I don't think you can go wrong with it. Again, tier 3, especially like the top tier 3 and not tier 3.5, is fine decks that you can definitely hit Mythic with. It's not like these 8 decks in tier 1 and 2 are the only decks you can ever win a game with. No, I've played so much of like these decks, the Fair Ritual, the Boros, and the Black Devotion on the channel, and we win a bunch of games with them. You can see my videos. Like you can totally win, and if you're a good player, you're going to have an easy time getting Mythic, even though it's just a tier 3 deck. Right, up next is Rakdos Scam, which is my least favorite Scam variant. So it's not terrible because some people have been innovating and trying to pull it forward. However, it's going to go a tier below Boros, which is a tier below Esper, which is a tier below Beans. It's not the best game variant. It still struggles with getting out top decked in some matchups. It still struggles, even though it's a Fury deck, Energy can still out top deck it and go around it. It does have some problems, but maybe someone can fix it. If no one can fix it, it's going to slip down the tier list, unfortunately. Up next are all-in Reanimate decks, and we're going to put them as fringe. And when I say all-in Reanimate, I mean this deck is going to cast a Faithless Looting or a Bone Shards, another 1-mana discard outlet, to put a big fatty in the graveyard and then cast the card Reanimate on it on turn 2. Maybe turn 1 with the Dark Ritual. The common card that they're reanimating is, I can't remember the name of it, but the new Eldrazi that's got hexproof from every color, and it's got Annihilator too. If you can get that card onto the board on turn 2, you win. Congratulations. It's just not the best strategy for best of 3. It relies on specific cards being in your opening hand, so I'm not a huge fan of it. If you want to rely on 2 specific cards being in your opening hand, why not just play the tier 1 deck show and tell? But with the card Reanimate in the format, there's always hope for Reanimator as an archetype. Up next is Sorin combo, which is a pretty decent tier 3 deck. And if you were to build Rakdos Scam, which is a deck that I was just a little down on, I think a good way to do it is to put the Sorin combo into it. And the same with Black Midrange. Sorin combo is a way to quickly close out and end games in black-based midrange decks. If you don't know the Sorin combo, Sorin Imperious Bloodward is a 3-mana planeswalker. You can minus it to put any vampire from your hand into play, and you could put like a bullcrap 7-mana vampire like Saint Alenda into play, and that more or less wins the game on spot when you are doing that on turn 3 or earlier. You can Dark Ritual Sorin on turn 1. It's very strong. Or most commonly, what I see people do is they play a Necropotence on turn 1, they draw a bajillion cards, and one of the bajillion cards is a Sorin, and one of the other bajillion cards is Saint Alenda. And that, I think, is probably one of the better ways to build Necropotence right now. Same with Black Devotion. You can view these as two different, like, reasonable playoffs that you can have for Necro right now. And Necro Storm is actually a third one. Right now, just playing, like, Necropotence just for mid-range value is kind of, you should probably have a combo win, so you can do Devotion, you could do Sorin combo, or you can do Necropotence Storm. I think all of them are pretty decent options when you're building a black deck right now. All right, up next is going to be Sultai Uro Oko, which in my notes I put in Fringe. It does have some good matchups, but unfortunately, just the Sultai value pile with Uros and Okos have really fallen off. Both Uro and Oko, despite being busted magic cards, and I mean busted, cannot contain the current aggro decks of the format, which is energy, namely. So I think that this deck is really poorly positioned. Oko as a card kind of just gets run over in the format right now. This deck can get disrupted really easily as well. It's tough. There are other decks that can get more value consistently. If you're saying, oh, let's play Sultai anyway just because it's a value deck, then why not play Beans, right? I'm struggling to see why you would specifically want to play like the Sultai Uro Oko deck right now, but it just have some really strong cards, so maybe you can make a comeback. That's why it's in tier 4 and not tier 5. Up next is going to be straight blue-white control, which we're also going to put in Fringe tier. I think that these builds are significantly worse than Flage builds, but it's reasonable. I think that having a streamlined mana base is nice. You still get to play Mana Drain and the One Ring, so that these decks built around Mana Wane, the One Ring, even some Teferis are okay. Just make sure that you're building your deck decently for the meta. Play cards like Wrath of the Skies to clean up the board, or Temporary Lockdown is another good one. Yeah, blue-ray controls, it's okay. I would highly recommend that you're playing Jeskai instead of playing blue-white, Esper, or any other blue-white variant, though. Up next is Winota, which was once forced to be reckoned with in the format. It was definitely at least a tier 2 deck at some point, but unfortunately it is another deck that has fallen off. Relying on a 4-mana creature resolving and staying in play is just not what you want to be doing in the format right now. This Dimir tempo deck would absolutely rip that deck to shreds. The energy deck would just win faster than it without needing to do some bullshit tutor out of your library combo. Show and Tell would also win faster than it. Beans would absolutely just like Solitude and Infuriate until there's nothing left. I'm saying this like hypothetically because like I haven't even seen anybody try to play the deck in months. Like it's, oh man, I can't imagine it having a good matchup against anything in the top 4. Up next is Yawg, which, where did I put it in my notes? In tier 4. I was debating between putting it in tier 3.5 and tier 4. I think that creature combo decks like Yawgmoth are a little bit underplayed. But Yawgmoth does have the problem that Primetime does, where one of the main things the deck is trying to do in Timeless is resolve a natural order, and a 4-mana sorcery is not the best thing to do when there are multiple top decks that can run the card Mana Drain. So Yawg is a little low, but I think this is a deck that could get better if we get more people working on it and trying to build a really dedicated Timeless version of the deck. Yeah, there's always hope for it. Like, we just don't have any really powerful mages playing Yawgmoth and Timeless right now. I think everybody who's playing Yawgmoth, all the really good Yawgmoth players I know, are still playing Historic because it's a little bit better for him. But maybe there's a Yawgmoth build that we just don't know about for the format yet. And up next is Domain Zoo, the last one. This used to be the premiered aggro deck before Energy took over, but unfortunately it's now Fringe tier. You can maybe even call it tier 5, but I think there's still a lot of merit to trying to play Domain, especially like the newer builds that I'm seeing. Like I'm seeing people put a Johnny into the deck, and I think that's a really good direction to try and take it. Domain is powerful. You can put out some really fast, really strong threats. You can play 2 mana 5/5s in the format, but there's other aggro decks like Energy that are going to be incidentally gaining life and playing higher quality cards than you. So it gets tough. But Domain Zoo, it still does have access to Leyline Binding as one of the best removal spells in the format. It also has access to Tribal Flames to burn opponents out of nowhere. So I do think that there is some merit to the deck, which is why I'm going to put it in Fringe tier instead of unplayable tier. And that's more or less my opinions. Keep in mind, my opinion, this will change. This is as of Modern Horizon being out for about a month. I think it's nice to do a little meta recap like this. So maybe about a month after every big set releases, I can go ahead and go over the state of the format, what decks are doing, what decks are not doing. We can use this same tier list too, so that we'll have all the same decks, and I'll point out any new decks that we add to the tier list. I think it could be super fun. So if you are looking for a new deck, or you are new to Timeless and you're wondering what to play, start at the top and just look for something that suits your playstyle. If you like aggro decks, look at that. There's one right in tier 1 for you. If you're a control mage, well, your options are either Jeskai or way down here. So you probably want to stick with Jeskai. But if you're the kind of guy who wants to play an elementals deck, you're like, okay, I have this option or this option or this option, and they all have pros and cons, and you can skip to the point in the video where the deck gets mentioned to get a better idea of it. I think that's enough for me. That was a lot of yapping, a lot of rambling. Hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you enjoyed it, and I will definitely make another one and keep making these every few months just to give like a little bit of an update on the format and keep people in the loop.